Hey, I'm Chris. I'm a freelancer in the motion picture industry here in Orlando, Florida. I primarily work as a director of photography and gaffer. As a freelancer, times can be kind of tricky diving from job to job, and I feel like YouTube's a good way to introduce myself to the community, meet other filmmakers in the area, and also just to show what it's like working as a freelancer. And every job is different, you know? You get big jobs, you get small jobs, but they all run different. And I just want to show the behind the scenes on how that works. This week specifically has been a pretty decent week. I got 4 days. As a freelancer, if you work in freelance, you know that's a pretty decent week to have 4 days. So I started this week off in Clearwater, a job that I found on Facebook. They were looking for a gaffer with equipment. I find a lot of work on Facebook that are looking for owner and operators. So somebody that is hired and then pretty much brings their own equipment. So every job is different. This specific client wanted a high key kind of look, which is not a lot of contrast, very high brightness. Our location was a kitchen. The night before, the DP opted for closing the side window just so we could control the lighting throughout the day, because it was gonna be like a longer day. Initially, I was going to shoot a 1200D through the window and then opt for fill on the other side, but things changed. And things always change. You just have to learn to adapt to the situation, and you know, you don't wanna like do it your way. Always make the client happy. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what it really looks like. We want to just make the client happy. Unless it's your project, then sure. But we're just here to do the job. A really hard time with this specific spot because the back kitchen wall was it was made of these glossy tiles, and the tiles were taking in all these reflections and showing like hot spots. So then I had to like bust out all the negative flags and start slowing down the brightness on some of these spots. When I came into the job, I had a totally different like way of thinking how I was gonna light it. So I was originally gonna shoot a 600 through a dome and through a 6x6 T-bone frame of magic cloth. The problem about that was that since the source was so direct and so straight on to the wall was giving me a lot of hot spots. And at first I was like, okay, well, maybe I can start slowing it down with some singles or doubles or even a floppy or whatever, a negative. So I found that bouncing the light helped a lot more than just directly shining my light towards the talent. It just gave that extra layer of diffusion and spreadness because the whole room was white. So that was a good sign of, especially with high key lighting. If I was to light a contrast scene in there, I wouldn't have needed a lot of negative. But since we were going for the high key look, bouncing the light was that one layer of diffusion and then flagging it down to slow down the hot spots on the wall. This was a smaller type of commercial. There was 6 of us. There was a director, the DP, myself as the gaffer, hair and makeup, and a PA and audio. It was a smaller crew than I was expecting. The client was for NVIDIA and it was for AI, unfortunately. I brought my whole house for this production. Literally every piece of equipment I owned, and what was funny is I realized that I didn't even need 25% of the power that I had in, you know. I had 2 300s and as a fill and a key, both hitting into the corners of the wall, and I had an F22C as an overhead in the back on a menace arm type rig. And then I had another 300X hitting the ceiling, which was just giving me an ambient fill in a specific area. But what was funny was both my key light and my fill light were only at 25%, and my hair light was at 17%. And I think the light I did have in the middle on the spotlight mount was at full. That was just giving me a big room ambient lift feel. Like the key and fill were more for my talent. So the light in the middle was really just giving me that room fill, ambient lighting, just filling in the shadows. The key and the fill were, you know, barely going over 25%. The only time we did ever go over 25% is if we went to high speed, which we did a little bit of high speed, some 60 and some 120. So then I had to maybe crank it up to 40%. So yeah, maybe having the light saved me a little bit, but if it was all shot in regular speed, I could have gotten by with like an Amaran 300, you know, and kept my package a lot smaller. You know, like I said, working in small spaces, You know, you don't always need the big guns. But it is nice to have just in case, especially if you want to like shoot slow-mo, or if things change in the original plan, or maybe I did need that 1200 and shoot it through the window. So bringing the extra gear can save you, but sometimes it's not always called for. So that was pretty much the whole lighting setup for about 80% of the day. There were some times where we went for close-ups and had to move the Menace arm a little bit, but there were a few instances where I got to use the spotlight mount to my advantage. And I just recently purchased this spotlight mount, and man, has it been a game changer. Just being able to shape your light in the way you want to just eliminates the whole need of having flags. I wouldn't say completely, but it gives you a different style of how to light things. And just being able to have those cutters and being able to shape my bounce light kept me from getting more of those hot spots that I was talking to you about. You know, if I were to have just the reflector dish and hitting into the ceiling, my light would have been spilling everywhere, and I would have been running into the same problem I would have been when I was in the beginning of the shoot. But just being able to shape the light and shape it off the wall and just kind of just make my own overhead lighting essentially really saved my butt in that shoot specifically. And there was also some instances where we were going for some close-ups, but I didn't have time to move the key light and the fill light just because they were on the other side of set, that I was able to just take that spotlight mount, point it to where I need to point at, which was a bounce board, and just cut the light directly into the bounce board and use it as a source without having to move any lights at all. You know, just using a bounce and then just shaping it to where it only hits that bounce. Honestly, recommend investing in a spotlight if you're trying to level up your lighting game and take it a little more seriously. So another key takeaway from this product is just working in small spaces. You know, like having all the big lights and sources is nice and all, but you'll soon realize that the stands are clunking into each other and just moving things around, and you know, so just sometimes you don't need all the big guns, especially with a high key kind of look. You know, you can get by bouncing a lot of your light. You know, there's not a lot of shaping involved, not a lot of flags. So keep your footprint small, you know, because once you start building all your lights and emptying all your cases, stuff gets chaotic pretty quickly. Yeah, I had it pre-lit in my head, but things changed immediately right when I got there. You know, you go in there with a mind of this is how I'm gonna light it, which you should with every project, but expect things to change, and that's exactly what happened on this. And you know, don't freak out, you know. I did a little bit, but I eventually figured it out. You know, I had all the tools, and I was like, I knew in my head that it's still possible. I have every tool in the book right now, you know? It's like there's no excuse not to get the job done. So you just have to find different ways to light things and be quick on your feet. You know, obstacles will happen. Don't freak out. It happens. You can kind of go in with a mindset of how you're gonna do it, but things change. Just expect it.